Welcome to the opening event of the Harvard International Development Conference of 2003. My name is Naina Patel and I am one of the conference co-chairs. For 9 years, the conference has been held at the John F. Kennedy School of Harvard University to engage students, faculty, and professionals in a dialogue on the most pressing issues in international development. The conference is a unique student-led event and is jointly organized by students from the Kennedy School, the Harvard Business School, Harvard Law School, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This year, the conference theme is Governance and Development in a Dynamic Global Environment. The theme recognizes the increasingly interconnected relationships between governance, development, and the changing international environment. These links are perhaps no better illustrated than in the ambitious work that is currently being undertaken in Afghanistan. In this respect, we are extremely honored to welcome Dr. Ashraf Ghani, Afghanistan's finance minister, as our inaugural speaker tonight. Dr. Ghani is a visionary individual of whom it has been said that the future of Afghanistan lies in his hands. Here to introduce him is Dr. Gaur Rizvi, director of the Kennedy School's Institute for Innovation in Government. Dr. Rizvi came to us in January directly from the Ford Foundation's South Asia program. Prior to that, he worked in various capacities in the international arena, including from 1988 to 1990, a special assistant to the UN coordinator for Afghanistan. Please welcome Dr. Rizvi.
Your Excellency, Minister, ladies and gentlemen, it's truly a tremendous pleasure here today to be able to welcome and introduce Dr. Ashraf Ghani, the Finance Minister of Afghanistan. Dr. Ghani, a very warm welcome. Many thanks for taking time to come and address the Kennedy School Forum. For me, it is a particularly welcome opportunity because, like many in this room, we have followed the struggles in Afghanistan for almost a quarter of a century, first against the Soviet invasion, and subsequently the long and often very painful struggle to restore democracy and tolerance in Afghanistan. And in that struggle, we have all followed with deep admiration the leadership that you and your colleagues have provided. There's another very important reason why we are grateful to you for coming this evening. It is not often that we get an opportunity to hear firsthand account from somebody from Afghanistan. And who better can tell us what is happening there than yourself? So we are very, very grateful to you. Personally, as I've already said, this is particularly a happy and a privileged moment for me, both to welcome you and to really offer my personal salute to the people of Afghanistan. I had the good privilege of working in Afghanistan during the late 1980s and early 90s, and during that assignment, I traveled the length and breadth of Afghanistan and formed a very deep attachment and admiration for the people of Afghanistan. It was something quite tremendous to see their courage, their success, their sacrifices, and above all, their humanity. So it's really, really wonderful. Most of you will have seen the biographical note of Dr. Ghani, but let me briefly say a few words. It would be impossible for me to summarize his many, many accomplishments, except to say he's probably one of the most accomplished persons we have had the privilege of welcoming, a distinguished anthropologist, a highly successful academic, a widely published author, has taught at universities in the US, in Europe, in Asia, and has, in midst of all these things, worked at the World Bank and found time to fight for his country and to lead his people to democracy. As I invite you to share some thoughts and experiences this evening, Dr. Ghani, I just want to share with you a conversation I had earlier today with a mutual friend of ours, Professor Roger Owen. When I asked him to come, if he was coming, he sent his apology, but he said that you probably have the most difficult and challenging job in the world. And I think most of us will agree that that could be an adequate description of your job. With that, may I welcome you to the podium, Dr. Khan.
Thank you, Ms. Patel, Dr. Rezvi, for those warm words. I'm delighted to be in your midst to speak about my people, a people who are poor but who have dignity and whose aspirations for a life that are ordinary know no parallel. Today in Afghanistan, we're dealing with an open moment in history. Such moments are rare because they could lead to many different directions. And it behooves us all to take advantage of a moment like this to deliver to the people of Afghanistan what they so richly deserve and have been denied for so long: peace, prosperity, and dignity. This moment is open for only a brief time. In my judgment, not more than a year. So we must deal with the issue as an urgent issue because the moment will close and the options will be very different. 5 years from now, if you're to get together to review what would have transpired, one of three following scenarios would be a possibility. A scenario, by definition, is a plausible sequence of events. The first scenario is a stable and prosperous Afghanistan. It'd be Western-friendly, it would have an international orientation. Internal displacement would be a memory. Refugees would have returned with honor and dignity. Government would be actively involved in poverty reduction through an active and affordable social policy. There'd be a prosperous private sector which would provide employment to not only directly alleviate poverty, but also to support and sustain eradication of the poppy culture. Afghanistan will be a full partner in the creation of regional and global security by eliminating terrorism and terrorist networks. The second scenario is that of a failed development project. Under this scenario, the country will lurch from crisis to crisis with intermittent successes along the way. Financial crisis, banking collapse, administrative crisis. It won't be able to pay its salaries because it wouldn't have reformed its public service. Plenty of capital assets would have started, but few would have finished. Because funding would have been slow in coming. The IMF and the World Bank would move from engaged development partners to stern arbitrators of conditionality. This, in short, would be the usual fate that so many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America have experienced. But there's also a third scenario, and that is of a narco-mafia state. Opium production would have significantly expanded. Mining, oil, and gas would have been taken over by domestic and international mafia. There would be widespread corruption. 300 people would be extremely rich. The remainder would be in abject poverty. Human rights violations will be the norm rather than the exception. Militia formations will become perpetual to support drug and mining operations. Ongoing emergency foreign assistance will be directed to humanitarian crises that would continue and expand. The international community would be searching in vain for reform partners. So our interim conclusion, the first scenario is the clear desire of the common men and women of Afghanistan and the international community to build a financially sustainable and accountable state. All interventions of all actors need to be subordinated to this goal. But should we not subordinate our actions single-mindedly to this goal, we should know that the other two scenarios are all too plausible. So how do we get there? First, we need 15 to 20% annual economic growth for 5 years in legal industry, not in opium. This will generate the employment opportunities to alleviate poverty and the opportunities for entrepreneurs to make their money in legal industries rather than poppy or arms. This will only happen with a major flow of international capital and if domestic wealth holders transform their cash into productive capital. We have far too much money in Afghanistan and far too little capital. Cash and capital are radically different notions. It's good governance that transforms cash into capital. It's institutions. Otherwise, you have mere money translated into high-rise rents and unbelievable agricultural land prices that would make no economic sense. Or, more nefariously, demonstration of luxury and many wives. To create this environment requires the creation of a sustainable state that is focused on, first, supporting the private sector through creating a predictable and transparent regulatory environment. Let me emphasize each of those words. Predictable. It means that the state must be subordinated to the law and not the law to the state. Transparent. All information must be at the disposal of the citizens. Regulatory. The state would not compete with the private sector, but regulate it. And delivering on the social needs of the community, particularly the most vulnerable. Delivery of social policy and affordable social policy is central to the building of citizenship. Without poverty alleviation through a coherent social policy, you do not get the bonds of citizenship. All you get is an elite and a mass divided against each other. And thirdly, security. But security within the rule of law. This requires radically changing the current networks by restructuring, reorienting, supporting, or destroying. We have terrorist networks that must be destroyed if you are to have peace. We have drug running and money laundering. These must be destroyed. We have legitimate global networks that must be expanded. We have Islamic networks that present moderation and our culture's long history. They must be consolidated. We also have networks of extremism that must be contained and legitimately debated and overcome. The constitution of the new nation is the outcome of this reordering of networks. Without such reordering, a nation is in danger. Afghanistan is unique in that it has a nation, the problem is the state. But the way the state is constituted or deconstituted would either consolidate the nation or turn the nation against itself. There is no better proof of the existence of the nation than the last 25 years. Any day of the month, the nation could have disintegrated had there been a separatist movement. But all the struggle was for control of the capital, not for separatism. What steps has Afghanistan taken so far in state building? The government has demonstrated its commitment to this reform and has started on the long path. In the recent budget process, our budget runs from March 21st to March 20th, highlights and demonstrates this. Now, as a result of long debate and discussion, there's a cabinet-agreed vision with programs. There are a series of principles that define the government's orientation. And three in particular are noteworthy. The government will regulate and not compete with the private sector. The government will focus on poverty eradication as its central objective, and the government will focus on elimination of corruption and subject itself to rule of law. The budget has become the instrument of policy. A budget must be one of the most boring things imaginable to you. How can these numbers, these folks who deal with numbers, but what I learned when I was, I think, 17 or 18 was something from Max Weber, who said, those who don't work must be paid for by somebody else, so follow the money. And ever since, I've done so, and it leads to some wonderful discoveries. Seriously, the issue is who makes decisions. And decisions on money, an allocation of money, or a bond between citizens and the state. After all, Boston's Tea Party should be an indication of that. In this town, I should not emphasize that. But what also a budget indicates is how poor a country is and how dependent. We've proposed a recurrent budget of $550 million and a developmental budget of $1,700 million. We have the lowest rate of consumption of electricity in the world and the highest rate of child mortality in the world. This budget is not going to change either of those statistics. It is just going to lay a foundation. So constraints are what come across. But what is in place, again, is constraints highlight efficiency. How each penny can be put to its best possible use. And that's what we've focused on. The third element that has come from this, and I think has been recognized as to be fairly unique in a post-conflict situation, is that it's the government and not the donors who've both provided the vision, the programs, and the instruments. The international community for 50 years has been preaching to governments to take the leadership. In Afghanistan, we've done so. And now it's the challenge. The challenge is to the international community to find ways and mechanisms to work with a reformist government. When one is preached for too long, one usually does not know how to deliver. We hope that together we can find the way forward. The mandate of this government is 1 year. In June of 2004, there will be elections. And I, for one, would happily relinquish this office and go to Kabul University. It's a job I've been wanting for a very long time and is being denied to me by my colleagues. But what is critical in terms of judging my efforts and those of my colleagues, all of us, is whether we hand over institutions that work. after we are gone. So our perspective, by necessity, is that of a decade and not of a year. This is a year where foundations are laid, and we should be judged not by whether we've built 50 schools or whether we've delivered the money that has come on time, but whether we have built an educational policy that would be remembered 20 years from now, or a financial management system that would provide the accountability in the sense of trust of the citizens of Afghanistan and the international community. What are the critical drivers for success? Is whether the state is controlled over two critical flows: the flow of force, the legitimate monopoly over the use of violence, and the flow of money. Currently, we have neither of these. But the definition of state is around those two flows. An example of this is customs. The people of Afghanistan are unique in demanding customs reform. It's not that they know the intricacies of customs. They usually tell me to do it. Once, when I was in a village with 400 people, I asked them, they told me, do this, that, and the other. And I said, how do I do it? And they started laughing. They said, we didn't invest all this money on you to tell you how to do it. Go get it done. But if you fail to do, you'll hear loud and clear from us. So there's a division of labor. But the reason they emphasize is that they see a direct connection between collection and retention of revenue by provincial big men and use of force. Force that threatens their life and does not protect them. So on to the role of the international community. The international community is both the major asset and the major barrier to the state taking control over the flow of force and the flow of funds. It's the major asset because construction of the state in Afghanistan requires a partnership. It cannot be done by Afghans alone, and it cannot be done by the international community alone. It requires an organic partnership, a partnership of equals, and a partnership that is based on mutual respect, debate, discussion, and action. But simultaneously, the international community is a barrier. Why? Because the international community has worked with bad governance for many years and now has some very entrenched notions as to how to do its business. And its business consists of establishing parallel institutions to the state instead of coherently working to establish a state. So, and here intentions are not the issue. It all flows from good intentions, but at times the way to hell is paved with good intentions. And I must, when it becomes necessary, take issue, and I do. I'm not a very popular man. But it comes with the job. When a finance minister becomes popular, you immediately know that something is wrong. So there you have your indicator. Running Kabul University, by contrast, would be a contest in popularity. Hence my desire. But to get back to some of the examples. One is that the way you get something done does not just depend on the outcome. It also depends on the process. So you can build schools, 1,000 schools. And in terms of the building of schools, the outcome is the same. but it matters a great deal whether it's the government that is decided and is seen by the population to be making those decisions and is held responsible for those, or whether it's the NGOs or private contractors contracted directly by an international aid organization. In one case, you build accountability and legitimacy. In the other, you get consolidation of the parallel institutions. The second is payment of wages. We have the lowest wages. Deputy ministers in the Afghan government get below poverty wages, below $1 a day, barely $2 a day. But international consultants come work for the same deputy ministers who are paid $600 to $800 a day. I don't understand the rationale of this. Since I don't get paid, it's not my personal problem, but it is an institutional problem. So the issue of resource flows is absolutely critical to establishing good governance. You cannot ask that pipes are rusty and leaking if you do not let flows go through them and establish whether there is indeed leakage. People cannot be condemned in advance, and reform cannot take place unless the focus is on building accountability and partnership. So funding channels matter very much. In here, let me just illustrate again what I've said. Model 1, the donor contracts, CARE, Oxfam, or another established NGO. And the benefits are provided. But in Model 2, the donor gives the money to the government, either directly or through a multilateral trust fund. The government weighs up all the competing needs of the country, including the short-term versus medium-term needs, the need for investment in development expenditure versus operating expenditure, the need for spending in international popular areas like health versus unpopular areas, like prisons, the need for spending to be undertaken on a national basis and to be geographically and ethnically neutral, and decides that a national emergency public works project should be funded. The government competitively tenders using international procurement rules for a supplier to deliver the program. Again, if you think that procurement is boring, that's where the money is. There's nothing more distinct, and there's nothing that gives me more heartache than procurement. It's been a year that I've been asking all donors to adopt one procurement program. Anyone. Japanese, American, World Bank. Would they accept? No. Because every procurement procedure is tied to domestic interests, and it's one of the most difficult to change. Yet the cost of it for efficiency, for effectiveness and transparency is extremely high. The listen, rules matter. And he who writes the rules, or she who writes the rules, more importantly, provides the game. Often we focus on the game, forgetting how the game has been defined. And in this situation, one of the most important things about good governance and development is to get the right rules. Define the game in a manner that would benefit the excluded and the poor, and provide for accountability. So in both cases, the money starts with the donor and ends up with the beneficiary, but the funding channels matter. Model 2 provides the opportunity to both have the services delivered and also to support the creation of sustainable administrative structure. By using multilateral trust funds, donors can require the recipient country to make use of international best practices in terms of accountability and transparency. And this has happened in Afghanistan with the insourcing of expertise into the government from leading international firms, including Bearing Point, formerly KPMG Consulting, Crown Agents, and PricewaterhouseCoopers. Most importantly, these practices can be entrenched over the coming years to ensure that when Afghanistan is financially sustainable, that the public can be assured that domestic revenue is treated with the same degree of sanctity. Let me move to my conclusions because I have 2 minutes left on my count. The three scenarios presented at the start of this talk have very different price tags for the international community, and the bills will be paid in very different ways. The stable state will require investment from the international development community of between $15 and $20 billion over the next 5 years to provide the physical and human capital development and the legal and structural development needed to ensure that the rules are predictable and enforceable. And this will ensure that the economy grows enough to generate domestic revenue in the region of 1.3 to 1.5 billion that will be needed to fund a functioning government. This represents a doubling of previous commitments and the extension of these commitments into the medium term. Moreover, the flow of funding must be centralized and not fragmented through multiple donors and multiple channels. The failed development experiment will still cost the international community 1.5 billion per year that is currently envisaged. It will be enough to band-aid over the chronic poverty and human suffering, but will make no dent in the systemic causes of this. When the funding reduces, the human development indicators will fall, and there will have been no lasting improvement. The narco-mafia state will have the lowest price tag. Aid flows will reduce because the money is either being stolen or the distribution is being blocked. But it will have the highest indirect costs in terms of policing and the social costs of consuming countries. More importantly, the international community would have lost a unique opportunity in an open moment of history to indicate and demonstrate that the clash of civilizations, so much talked about, is avoidable. You can, and we must, have a Muslim country that is moderate and developmental oriented. A Muslim country that is keenly interested in good governance. That is the wish of the majority of women and men of my country. And the reason is very simple. We've been terrorized by the left and by the right. Therefore, we believe in the path of moderation. And that is the path of partnership, both with the international community, the international civil society, and most of all, you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ghani. That was truly a most insightful and a finely analytical talk, which is much appreciated by all of us. And I think your vision for Afghanistan is also truly very, very inspiring. Thank you. The minister has agreed that he will take some questions. May I suggest, as you ask questions, give us your name, your institutional affiliation, and if I can remind you, please ask a question and don't make a speech. Thank you. I'll put my glasses on so I don't miss anybody. Yes, please. There's already a few. Oh, fantastic. Go right ahead.
My name is Lindy Miller, and I'm a student at the Kennedy School in the MPAID program. And I'm wondering, I think it's very admirable that you're seeking a different kind of solution other than the repetitions we've seen in the past. And the problems you're having with procurement, I sympathize with, and I can understand both sides. And what I'm wondering is, how can you convince, or how do you best think you can convince the donors and whatever other organizations or countries there are to give the money to the government and to actually ensure that there isn't corruption now and that the money will be used to end any corruption there is? I mean, how can you do that effectively?
What would you be comfortable?
One at a time.
One at a time is okay.
Yes, that's a wonderful question. The essence of the answer is by creating institutional mechanisms that result first in trust. And trust is established first and foremost by being transparent. I've made a commitment for the first time in Afghan history to make all the expenditure of the government available to the press and to civil society and to anybody else who would ask. That would ensure that we can move forward. The second is that there's a rule in the budget, in the current year's budget. If any misuse is found, the first time that organization loses that amount from its future expenditure. If there is a recurrent of that, it uses double the amount. Third is, again, by rules. We are rewriting our procurement law to make it as compatible with global practice as possible. So classic things is, one is making the hierarchy responsible and accountable. Second, providing maximum voice to citizenry and to our partners. And thirdly, subjecting ourselves to a monitoring system that is neutral. 1/3 of our expenditure now is being regularly audited by a World Bank managed group, because the World Bank is the manager of a trust fund through which most of assistance comes. And most importantly, take the government out of a lot of business and radically simplify the procedures. I'm now in the midst of customs reform, and it's extremely corrupt. But the core of it is going to be re-engineering the processes, shortening the steps, opening it to public scrutiny, getting scorecards from the citizenry to seeing how they judge it. That's how we would move forward. But also, we would ask, and we have asked and obtained, that the expenditures of our partners also be subjected to the same degree of scrutiny, and not just ours, to see whether their practices indeed are the most efficient, the most transparent, and the most accountable or not. We all need to be judged on the same level playing field.
I'll take one question. But please.
Welcome, Mr. Ghani. My name is Ernesto De Leon from Tampa, Florida, president of the Opportunity Investment Group. I want to ask you something. At the beginning, you said that in 5 years, you're going to review the progress in your economic progress in your country based on 5 steps. Then you said that almost at the end that you have problem procuring the grants from the international community. Don't you think that 5 years is quite a short term if you have that kind of problem with the international community?
5 years is a lifetime. I judge my days by 5 days. No, seriously, I mean, yes, and 5 years I think is a sufficient step, because typically major structural reforms take about 3 years. The first 3 years, 2 to 3 years, are extremely painful, and then you really see the benefits. So the agenda of change that we have, with proper support, would allow us to go through the painful processes, but also see the major developmental benefits. I'm not saying that in 5 years, Afghanistan is going to be a middle-income country. It's not going to be. But it would be in the upper ranges of the poor. It would have changed significantly our horrible child mortality and women in birth mortality. Those things can change in 5 years. They could be halved. We can reduce it by half. I'm convinced of that. We can have a network of highways. We can have farm to market. We have women's cooperatives, a made by Afghan women label that would allow our women to benefit from economic opportunities. There's, in the area of transparency and accountability, there's tremendous amount that can be done in 5 years. I intend to do a lot of that in 1 year.
Thank you.
Yes, there, please.
Hello, my name is Claudio Kinizek. I'm from the Harvard Business School. I had a question regarding the budget that you expect in the next coming years. I was wondering if you could give us a sense of what percentage of that budget is going to come from internally generated funds, taxes, and so forth, versus money coming in from NGOs. And what are the major sources of those internally generated funds, and how do you see that changing as institutions develop and the country develops? Thanks.
Thank you. That answering you know, requires 15 minutes. So you'd have to do with the $5 version. It's a great question, thank you. First, in terms of the recurrent budget, we have a budget of $550 million. $200 million of this is going to come from domestic revenue. Last year, only $80 million came from domestic revenue. So on the IMF's judgment, this is an aggressive target. The bulk of this year, is going to come first from reform of customs. Simplification of the customs, elimination of corruption, and most importantly, centralization of revenue at the central government will provide. The second area would be telecom. Telecom is the first area that we've managed to tender very transparently internationally. So an international company is coming, and that would generate another important area of income. Third would be rights over flights, overflight rights, particularly with the current war, traffic is increased. In terms of situation in years to come, the most important source first we are looking at is mining. Afghanistan has some of the richest mines, copper and iron, in the world, and 110 semi-precious and precious range of minerals. And then oil and gas. Gas is proven, oil is in the exploratory phase. And that's where, again, getting the state right really matters. As the book Paradox of Plenty demonstrates, except for Norway, no oil well producing country has gotten institutions right. So we must get it right before we have mineral wealth, because rent is an extremely dangerous phenomenon for a fledgling state. If you don't have accountability and transparency and rent flows, it's going to be very difficult. But the second area we're looking at is actually transit trade. We have a very ambitious plan currently, work with our neighbors, to turn Afghanistan from a landlocked country to a land bridge between Central Asia and South Asia. We envisage a series of dense networks, starting from oil and gas, to energy, to transport, connecting us. And that would provide enormous amount of opportunity. And third is service. Fourth, and most important probably in the medium term, is going to be tourism. It's a wonderful country. And it's worth visiting when when the circumstances are right.
I can vouch for that. It is one of the most beautiful countries.
Thank you. My name is Michael Hager. I'm Executive Director of Conflict Management Group here in Cambridge. And I too can vouch for the beauties of Afghanistan, since I spent a lot of time there in the 70s, where I first met you, Mr. Minister.
Yes, and I recall fondly.
You've given us, and I thank you for it, a very eloquent presentation of the enormous challenges that you face in terms of the economic development of your country and your strategy for addressing them. The UN Secretary General has made the point that there can be no development without peace. And I wonder if you'd like to comment on the issue of peace in your country, given some of the factions and divisions, and what the impact of the peacekeeping, the peace effort, the unification effort will be on your economic development.
Thank you. And I remember our meetings from the 70s and in later years very fondly, and thank you for your question. Security is the foundation of development. Without security, there cannot be development. Because the ordinary women and men of Afghanistan judge their security very simply, but extremely effectively. Can a woman travel from one end of the country to the other without being molested? Can a man travel from one part to another without being stopped and robbed of his well-earned income? On that score, we have still a major challenge to overcome. We had a war and a civil war, and then an international conflict. We have deep scars. There have been many violations of human rights. I had to designate about 10 sites of the country as sites requiring not just physical rehabilitation, but social and psychological rehabilitation. We don't have psychiatrists. Otherwise, I would have asked hundreds to go to these areas. Healing is going to take time. We've preferred peace at this moment to justice. It has been a heavy bargain. We've had to close our eyes to many things in order to allow for peace, because our citizens very deeply yearn for peace. All of us have had to compromise. But in the process, during this year, we've learned to live together and to argue. People who used to argue with guns with each other now are arguing about budgets. And they've all developed a mutual dislike of me, so that I think is much progress. Regardless of which part of the world they come from, they at least have one thing in common: the Ministry of Finance be damned. But seriously, with two areas where we're working very hard, both among ourselves within the international community. One is to create a national army, and the other is to create a national police. Both of these are stretch targets. They're going to require the best of our efforts, because there are many interests that would rather prefer that the networks that came from years of war and conflict endure. Those projects must not be allowed to succeed. That the project of creation of the national army and the national police must move forward. And that's what we are focusing on. These are difficult reforms, but we are engaged in a manner of reforming that is cooperative. And we hope that the process would move forward. I'd like also to take a special moment to first bemoan the loss of life that members of ISAF, the International Peacekeeping Force, have endured in order to allow us to live in peace. And second, to thank them for the special role that they're playing in policing of Kabul. We had wished, and we had repeatedly expressed that expansion of ISAF would move the security agenda much forward. The international community did not deem it suitable to do so. That is one of the constraints under which we live. But that's why we're focused now very heavily on creation of the national police and the national army. And I'm delighted to report to you that the new Minister of Interior has actually created human rights watch groups in every police station that he's creating. That is the way to create a responsible police.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Deborah Kaufman. I'm at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And my question is the following. I realize this is an international development conference and you're focusing on the international role. However, I'd like to just expand that a little bit and ask you to kind of locate the domestic factor within the overall goal of development and progress of your country. I'll be a little bit more specific. Many of the reforms and many of the specific initiatives you're talking about target, in a way, the culture of the people, some of the more negative aspects, and you're talking about dramatic change in that way. So I guess if you can, try not to be too amorphous, if you can just kind of balance the international aspect that you've been talking about with the domestic factor, how you see this complementing, or maybe there's a struggle there, if you can just touch on that to balance what you've said. Thank you.
Thank you. First, we have drug dealers. I hope I indicated that in terms of the danger of a narco-mafia state. The drug dealers wouldn't want reform. They would want consolidation of networks of drug and corruption. They are going to be an immense threat to peace and stability. They would not like a reformist state. They would not like an effective state. That is the rule. Second, we have very vocal women. When discussions took place in last year's emergency law jirga, we had discussions between women of Kabul and the men who had ruled Kabul between 92 and 94. And after a while, the men's bodyguards were threatening the women with violence because they could not argue with them with words. And that showed who had the justice on their side. The women of Kabul asked these men to explain the rapes of young girls and women that had taken place in the name of Islam, and asked them what kind of Islam did they represent. They asked them to account for how the museum was stolen and where the goods went. They asked for accountability. And the men had to run for cover or threaten violence. That is an internal factor. We have warlords. Warlords that were put there through their connections with the international community, because they saved lives of the members of coalition, but now are oppressors. We have men and women who are vulnerable, 5 million of them, who are immensely vulnerable to food deficiency, to vitamin deficiencies, to lack of nutrition. We have endured 5 years of drought. In addition to war, in addition to impositions. And they aspire to assistance. But first and foremost, they look for rain. Fortunately, rain is far more even-handed than international assistance. It doesn't come with conditionalities. It's delivered directly, and it produces results. We also have over 100 newspapers and a number of radios. So there's debate, there's immense debate, there's immense discussion. People are imagining very different futures. Some would like one type of Afghanistan, some would like another. The key is that there's a consensus in the country among the absolute majority that violence must not decide our future, that we must settle our future politically. There's also a consensus, if I read my country right, that we want a country that is moderate. A country, we are very secure in our identity. We've never felt the need to choose between Afghan and Muslim. Islam is part of our makeup. It's been a moderate Islam. The Taliban were an aberration. And the reason they're an aberration is that when now they make their appearance to some village, we don't have an efficient government. We don't have an intelligence service that works. Fortunately, probably. It's people of the villages that run and tell us who's made their appearance. It's the ordinary men and women who have a stake in engagement with the international community. This is what makes Afghanistan internally very unique. When I returned to Afghanistan in December of 2001, having left in 1977, I went as the senior advisor to Mr. Lakhdar Brahimi, the special representative of the Secretary General. I was convinced that I would never work with the government. And the reason being, I thought the people of Afghanistan would never take the presence of Americans or all these others. I had left a nationalist country. I went through 10 provinces in a month. They were internationalists. They were far ahead of me. And so when President Karzai asked me to take the suicidal job, I said yes.
Please.
Yes, hello, Mr. Minister. Thank you for being here. My name is Kristen Kurzak. I'm from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I wanted to ask if you would comment on what institutional mechanisms are being implemented to address the participation of women, Afghani women, in the political and development process.
Thank you. First, the emergency law jirga that met in June and for the first time elected the president through a secret ballot had a very significant number of women in it. So that is the most significant political event, and all commissions after that have involved participation of women. But the most significant long-term development is the number of children that entered school. 40% of the children that entered school last year were girls. That is our long-term banking on how relations are going to change. Historically, there are both advantages and disadvantages in the way our culture is structured gender relationships. First, positively, women have always had the right to property. My grandmother is the person from whom I learned my feminism, because many men, particularly Pashtun men with their big egos, would say, oh yes, we are going to go and tell her, and they would come inside the house and tremble in front of her. A fact that I think my daughter has taken to make me tremble in front of her. So there's that side. But there's the other, which has been the very brutal segregation of women recently. And while there are many opportunities, there are also many constraints. It is going to require a very, very systematic effort to keep the gender issue on the forefront of the agenda. I've indicated that we would be laying the basis in the budget of a gender budgeting in future years. We don't have the capacity to do so now, but it would be very important. We're also initiating a program for entry of senior women into the Ministry of Finance and addressing the same thing through a range of other. But the most important part of it is going to be the participation of the women themselves. Our women, whether urban or rural, are very vocal. And they're able to provide voice. And as long as they can focus, it's going to be important. One last area is going to be extremely significant, tying into my first. Their ability to participate in the market. All the carpets of Afghanistan are produced by women, but all the middlemen are men. We have to work to empower the women to have their own organizations and to be able to deal with both the national market and the international market themselves. So there are going to be networks and ties to their empowerment that are going to come through their control of resources. I spent many years looking at family dynamics globally, and one of the conclusions is women who control resources are structurally in very different positions of power than those that don't. So we must work not to just have a slogan of empowerment, but the means of changing that into concrete control over assets. And that is what we are doing through a series of rural development programs and other programs.
We are rapidly running out of time, so we'll take two last questions. First here, and then you. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for your comments. I've recently returned from East Timor, where the people face somewhat similar issues as in your country. And we fought for 2 years to raise the social welfare budget from $50,000 to $250,000 for that government. In 2001, we watched a large amount of promised financial assistance disappear towards your country. And I wanted to ask you about the fickleness of international aid and how you planned for that, and what the current situation in the world with the war in Iraq, how that is going to change your planning and the way you think about the next 5 years, as well as another question of how, if there are benefits to falling a little bit outside of the glare of the world media and attention, or whether there are mostly drawbacks, and how you're dealing with thinking about all of this as focus, the very fickle focus of the media and some of international attention changes.
Thank you. First of all, there's a lot of money in the aid system chasing few good countries. Good countries, like good men, difficult to find. So if we proceed with reform, we would actually not have difficulty attracting assistance. Breaking out of the vicious circle requires fundamental commitment to change. Look at Uganda in Africa. You know, has no difficulty compared to other sub-Saharan African countries. So one of the most important things is that. Second is, in our vision of development, aid is a magnet for trade. I do not want dependency on aid. I'm far more interested in courting the Afghan diaspora, in negotiating with them to see that the conditions that they want to see, to bring their capital back or create it, than courting the aid system. Because those people, if their money can turn into capital, and we are privileged that we have Afghans who have thrived in the hardest circumstances and have managed to make it. They have reservations, and we must enter item by item to discuss their reservations and change those to seeing the enabling conditions. The third observation is Afghanistan's neglect resulted in the payment of a very heavy price by the international community. Once neglect, one-time neglect, could be attributed to misunderstanding or not understanding. I hope that the international community and the international media understands fully well what is at stake in Afghanistan. We, the Afghans, are quite willing to put our lives not to let the past be repeated. The least we expect is that the international community will also have learned its lesson. If Afghanistan is ignored, again, the world would have itself to blame, and only itself.
Please.
I hope this, Abdulaziz Al-Naim, an MIT student. I hope this question isn't too early, but a good financial system is needed for development of any country. And judging by experiences of other Muslim countries, because you said that the majority of Afghans want to have a Muslim country, especially Saudi Arabian experience, you face a problem seems to be faced across the board, which is you either take a capitalistic system and impose it, but have a conflict with the general system of the country, or adopt a more a financial system, an Islamic financial system within the frame of the Islamic law, which hasn't been developed for the last 1,000 years. And so there's always a tendency to end up with a system somewhere in the middle that is internally inconsistent. I'm just wondering if you have any ideas on how you would avoid that problem.
Well, first of all, on the Sharia, anthropologists are funny animals. You know, we study a lot of things, and I spent a long time, about 5 years of my life, studying Islam, including 1 year living in madrasas after I had gotten my PhD. The first point I would make is that Sharia is not underdeveloped commercially. It's an extremely advanced.
I mean, institution-wide.
Let's take it one step at a time. The Jews of Cairo, Ghanese records demonstrated, all settled their disputes in medieval time according to Sharia, because the Sharia provided a maximum leeway. So there's this popular imagination that Sharia is all about cutting off arms and hands. The other side of it is one of the most advanced commercial codes on the face of the earth. And take personal law. Marriage is a simple contract in Islamic law. California women would still want it. You can put any conditions in a contract, as my wife and I found out. So there's that point, you know, that again, there's a stereotype that the recent ulama have created that really has nothing to do with Sharia, because the problem with our current ulama is that they have very little knowledge of classic Islam. It's one of the tragedies of Islam that it was extremely cosmopolitan and global in thinking and action. A judge from Morocco could function anywhere in between, in Afghanistan or India or others, practicing on the same code. So there is a base. Second is that our people in Afghanistan have been mercantile people for millennia, both before Islam, after Islam, and now. They have complex networks in education mechanisms, and a lot of these education mechanisms are global. So we do not feel that there's a conflict. Thirdly, the banking system in Afghanistan was established in 1929 without a problem. It was established by Afghan merchants themselves locally. So there are areas of synthesis. And again, as you would know from the Ottoman history, there's the realm of Sharia, and then there's the realm of Qanun, or law. There are a lot of subjects on which Sharia is silent. And it has been understood that development of those areas is going to be an important area. Where your point still retains validity, and I acknowledge it, is that imposition from outside is not possible. There must be debate and consensus over the shape of institutions and the way they are going to be developed. And there, the judgment is that of the public of Afghanistan. And I hope that they would be making the right judgment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I think this applause has said everything, so I won't spoil it by adding more to it. Kavita, do you want to say the last word?
Hello, I'm Kavita Kapoor. I'm the other co-chair of this year's Harvard International Development Conference. I'd like to thank both Dr. Ghani and Dr. Rizvi for being here with us this evening. We hope to continue sharing these experiences and ideas during the course of tomorrow's panels. We'll start at 9 a.m. here in the forum with our second address by Professor Michael Ignatieff, Director of the Carr Center for Human Rights. And we'll continue to further explore the theme of governance and development in a dynamic global environment. We hope you can join us. We will be taking registrations beginning at 6:30 in Taubman ABC here at the Kennedy School. Finally, before we close, I would like to recognize the hard work and support from the many remarkable people that have made this year's conference possible. I would like to thank our keynote speakers, Dr. Ghani today, followed by speakers tomorrow, Professor Ignatieff and President Summers, and our many panelists for agreeing to participate in this year's conference. They represent highly accomplished leaders from business, government, academia, civil society, and international organizations from whose knowledge students and professionals alike will directly benefit. I would also like to thank the faculty, staff, sponsors, and students without whose contributions this conference would not have been possible. Please enjoy the rest of the weekend's events. I hope you find it as a valuable forum for exploring ideas and developing solutions that are as dynamic as the global environment in which we live. Thank you.
Yes, the minister wants to suggest a word, please.
I would like to recognize two of my colleagues, Claire Lockhart and Michael Carnan, whose work has just been unbelievable, and I'm always indebted to them. So, Michael and Claire, many thanks. They're examples of the type of dedication and partnership that has made our enterprise possible. Thank you.